Hello. There's lots of room. It's going to take some while for the room to fill up, but I don't think it's going to get so full that you all have to spread out. So if people feel like moving around and getting forward, that'd be fine. Thanks for coming. I'm Steve Wilson. I'm from Constellation Research, a Silicon Valley-based independent analyst firm, and I lead a stream of work on digital safety and privacy. I'm a technologist by training. I've been in security and identity for a very long time. I stumbled into privacy accidentally and learned the hard way that technology impacts privacy. Privacy is a technology issue. Privacy is not a technology issue. There's a whole lot of sort of gestalt things happening in privacy, and we're going to unpack that today. We want to challenge some of the hoary old cliches about privacy and innovation and privacy and consumers. So I'm going to very quickly introduce the panelists. I'm really delighted to be joined by Danny from Terbium Labs, and Danny's got a tremendous bumper sticker slogan for what he's all about. Jeremy Grant, who's well known in this city from Venables. Elizabeth Reineris, who's an entrepreneurial attorney, and I think we're going to understand how entrepreneurship and the law go together. And Magdi from Omidyar, who's right on the leading edge of this theme of ours, the race to the top. How is it that we're going to energize business models to be not just privacy respective, but privacy positive? And how do we do much better? So we're all going to take a couple of minutes to position the particular themes with our guest speakers' backgrounds, and then we're going to have some rhetorical questions. We're going to unpack some of these issues, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions. Danny, tell us about yourself.
Thanks for having me. Danny Rogers, the founder and CEO of Terbium Labs. We're a dark web data intelligence firm in the cybersecurity sector. And we have a particular take on this space that really makes us a very trust-forward business model, both some specific technology that we bring, as well as just generally being in the cybersecurity sector. And I position us as really a big bet on whether or not privacy really is important in the industrial side of things, or the commercial side of things. Our success or failure really lives on the importance of privacy in the commercial sector, I would say.
So I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm managing director at Venable. We're a law firm down the street, though I'm not a lawyer. There's a longer story there, but we can get into it over drinks later tonight if you want. I've been working more than 20 years in DC at the intersection of identity and cybersecurity, sometime in the policy and government world, sometime actually building things, sometimes doing investment advisory work, helping investors try to understand what's happening in the space and where there's opportunities. I also coordinate the Better Identity Coalition, which is a group of, I think we're up to 19 companies now, working on a policy framework. You might have heard Congressman Foster mentioned it this morning, and he thought it was pretty good, which I was pleased to see and wasn't expecting. But laying out really what role the government should play in trying to encourage better identity systems going forward that, among other things, really embrace the idea of a race to the top.
I'm Elizabeth Reineris. I'm the founder of a consultancy called Hacky Lawyer, which focuses on law and policy engineering. I found a desperate need in the legal field for lawyers who understand technology and who can translate between technologists and lawyers and policymakers, and so that's sort of the need that I'm filling. My background initially was in cybersecurity with DHS. Thereafter, I was in London from 2012 to 2016 working on the first draft to the very last draft of the GDPR. When I came back to the US, I was in-house at 2 digital identity startups and just recently launched my own consultancy. So I come at this from the standpoint of startups and large enterprise alike, governments and private sector alike, and cross-border issues as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Magdi Amin. I'm from the Omidyar network. We take a view at Omidyar that the particular team I work in is digital identity. We incorporate both formal issued identity that governments or banks may issue, and this conference is largely addressing it, but also the fact that through our engagement with digital systems and the data that's collected on us, we're effectively being identified and profiled. And we view that both forms of identity, sort of the formal as well as the de facto entity, need to be substantially improved from a sort of a human standpoint. And at Know, we launched this effort called Race to the Top with the following point of view. So we believe that the industry right now is in a crisis of distrust, that the way our data is being managed and handled is alienating people, and that survey after survey show that, I think the Axios said that 58% now see identity and data privacy issues essentially as a crisis. It's up from 51%. And then when people are asked about whether they trust systems to make good decisions, so it's not only privacy, but machine learning and algorithmic bias, they would trust a coin toss more than they trust machine learning. And that's an HSBC survey. When you get to those sort of levels of distrust and overlay on top of that the onset of regulation, given that it's not just about perceptions, it's about a systematic pattern of bias, privacy violations, and exclusion that's led to where we are today, we are in a race to the bottom. But as venture capitalists, we send signals as to what the data economy we want to be is, and we can invest in the data economy we want to see. We believe it is an economic good, as well as commercially viable and human-centered, to put trust at the center, to focus on privacy and transparency and inclusion. And when we do that collectively, we're in a race to the top. And so we've put together a coalition of about 13 VCs and about 8 other sort of thought partners, including a couple on the stage, to demonstrate and create race to the top. And we're working through it right now, and we'll talk a little bit more about on the panel.
So we've got Terbium, which is a bet that privacy matters. We've got Omidyar and your group of VCs that are maybe proving the experiment that the market can look after privacy. I've got a view that privacy is a lot like product safety, and that it is difficult for market forces left to their own devices to look after privacy. Meanwhile, legislation. We've got 130 countries in the world with privacy legislation. China and the US are the only major economies that haven't legislated to date. Depending on how long your view is of history, this is either taking an inordinate long period of time, or the market is sorting itself out. But before we talk about the market forces and the race to the top, I just love that slogan. Let's talk about legislation, because obviously the CCPA is huge and there are other states to follow. We've got technologists, we've got lawyers, we've got investors. What are our expectations of legislation? What is there to fear about the legislation that's coming in the US, and what's the upside? Do we think it's going to stimulate?
I can start. So I first want to take a step back. So I'm sure lots of technologists and commercial folks as well in the room have heard of this idea of product market fit. I think there's a similar issue around law, and I think often we tend to legislate without really understanding who the target audience for the legislation or regulation is. So one of the things that's really important in this space is, I'm sure you've all seen the really old New Yorker cartoon about, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. Except that's not true, right? Jeff, Mark, Sundar, these people know who you are. They know that you're a 12-pound, 10-year-old chocolate brown miniature pincher that lives, in Flushing, Queens, that you like turkey bacon. So the reality is that people do know exactly who you are. It's just that we have aligned incentives in a certain way where the people who know who you are the advertisers on the large tech platforms. And so this all comes back to the business model, which is why we're here at Identiverse talking about a race to the top and about venture capitalists and funding and entrepreneurs. So tying it all back in sort of that macro context, I think what's really important about the legislation is it designed to target the correct audience? Is it in fact considering that perhaps the customers of these platforms and these tech companies are not the individuals that are using the platforms, but of course the advertisers and the data brokers and all the other third parties involved in the ecosystem. So I kind of look at it through that macro lens. In terms of things coming online like the CCPA and the GDPR, In reality, they're really taking decades-old principles
Yeah.
that stem from the 1970s and just baking them into existing law. And so there's really nothing new or novel about the approaches. There might be a slight innovation around things like privacy and data protection by design. There's some innovation around things like data portability. But for the most part, we sort of know what we need to do. And a lot of the factors that have made these laws and regulations ineffective is around things like the business model.
Yeah, and so, the US gets a bad rap internationally. I'm here to tell you this as an Australian. The US reputation, I think, is partly undeserved because the FIPS, the Fair Information Practice Principles, have always said, don't collect information that you don't need, have purpose specification, don't repurpose information. So you're right, these principles have been around for a while.
Well, the principles have been around for a while, but they haven't applied to the business models. And I think the big innovation is less on the what, but more what the magnitude of the punishments, which is what will impact the business model, right? I mean, pre-GDPR, right, these $100 billion companies were being punished with $500,000 fines. And I think the big thing that made people pay attention to GDPR is the size of the teeth to the law that at least starts to have a real effect. I don't even know that it still does. That still remains to be seen. But I mean, I think it's interesting that you point out the two countries that have a bad rap, so to speak, are China and the US. And those are the two markets where there are dominant, for different reasons, dominant models that, we call it the AI wars, right? But they're really, if you dig down, it's really the sort of behavior modification wars. And just different people, different groups wanting to modify behavior, whether it's the commercial sector through advertising, ad tech, or what is now the behavior modification engines at scale for rent, or in China, more government-focused population
Social control
behavior modification. And I think for those reasons, those are the two markets where privacy is very much not part of that calculus, right? It's just different massive centers of power that are there to invade it, so to speak.
That's the biggest lens to look at this through, is that information is power. Privacy is about restricting information, and therefore it threatens all sorts of incumbent interests.
And so whether it's the power of the commercial market or the power of the party, those are the two places where there's these massive entrenched centers of power around information.
So we'll go to Jeremy, because I think you can contextualize this around identity in your experience there.
Sure. Well, and I think I want to talk a little bit more about what a federal U.S. privacy law might look like a little bit later and what the timeline might be, because I do think if anything, we can all speculate and then decide in a few years if we were right or not. But I think there's a broader thing which is going on, which is just how even the threat of a law, or the fact that there are real issues right now with compliance and enforcement with both GDPR and CCPA, that I think is starting to combined with some of the efforts of firms like what Omidyar Network's been doing, just to try and get people to think differently about how we treat data, is starting to change the market, and it's really starting to, I think, get companies thinking about things differently. I mean, historically, the question with personal information has been, how much can I collect and get away with? And, without getting sued, basically. And, look, I work in a law firm, although I'm not a lawyer. We've got one of the biggest privacy practices in the country. We're really good at that, actually, helping people structure things around that. But that's not necessarily about protecting privacy. That's just about compliance and legal risk management. So I think where I'm seeing things change is, yes, on the policy side, where you're now seeing Europe Act, California Act, a whole bunch of proposals coming up here on the federal side. But they're also changing in the market side. I think one where you've got consumers getting more fed up with a lot of the default, and they're just less trusting these days compared to where they had been. And companies, I think, are starting to come around to the idea of realizing that good privacy and treating consumer data respectfully, I guess if that's the right word, might actually be good for business. So on the identity side, I think it's been an interesting evolution. So I mentioned before, I spent time in government. I came into government the second time in 2011 to launch the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, the NSTIC program for the Obama administration. And we had this bold guiding principle, which is that identity solutions should be privacy enhancing. Well, in 2011, that actually ticked a lot of people off. I mean, we had public workshops around the country where a number of companies, got, if aggressive is the right word, but forcefully, argued and asked the question: does privacy even matter these days? Is privacy just dead? Is this really something that's a meaningful goal? And a lot of them just weren't willing to go down that road. I don't think they were thinking anything different than the old model. So 8 years later, a lot's changed. A lot of the companies that I was arguing with back in 2011 now partnered, over the last year and a half to form the Better Identity Coalition, where one of our focus areas is actually trying to drive policy solutions that can enable identity solutions that have better privacy. How do we actually start to change the model of the way that we do identity from one where companies that we may not even know are collecting data on us without our opt-in consent to when we're actually able to assert more control over our data and proactively request that, whether it's a company or whether it's a government agency, somebody who actually knows something about us can be a partner for us in helping us vouch for ourselves and assert who we are. And that idea is it's starting to get some currency. I think the second big trend is on the investment side, where I still do some work in the space helping investors think about it, is I think both because of frankly really forward-leaning people who are trying to do the right thing, like Magdi and the Omidyar Network folks, but also at a more, I don't know if selfish is the right word, but I'll use it here. If you're an investor, you want to invest in things that can make you money and minimize risk. And I don't think there's any investor these days who can be considering where they want to put their dollars without taking the time to actually contemplate the really real risks, both with the laws that have been passed as well as with the laws and regulations that might be coming. And so it's really incumbent on any investor to be thinking about how models might be changing, both driven by government and driven by consumers who are just fed up, and start to think about putting their money in companies that might take a different approach other than let me collect everything I can and hope I don't get sued.
And Magdi, what about the holy grail of having privacy rules and regulations that are actually leading to innovation and leading to technology improvements?
Right. So this question of technology versus regulation.
Yeah.
So our view is that, first of all innovation occurs within constraints. If it's not, if drugs can be developed without any control trials, I'm not sure if that's innovation that's very sustainable. Innovation, in a way, is also prompted by regulation. Regulation creates entry points, but the intent of the regulation can't happen unless technologists get to work. Filling those entry points with solutions that resolve the tensions that were raised in the first place by voters. So we see this very much in sync. But we also think that companies should get ahead of regulation. We shouldn't be solving for GDPR per se. We already know that GDPR has a number of issues around consent, and that people are thinking well beyond GDPR and data trusts and cooperatives and many other questions. We also know there's different ways to solve each of the specific directives emerging from GDPR. Everything from sort of right to erasure, any of the data subject rights ultimately need to be solved with a technology problem. But getting ahead of that, prioritizing trust, prioritizing a recreation of the relationship between individuals and technology is something that we think is very much viable. It may take time, but anything that, so if you look at the food sector 30 years ago, nobody talked about organic foods or even health foods. Until there was a viable choice where customers can say, okay, well actually I now recognize that with nutrition labeling and regulation help create awareness. But until there was a technological approach to solving for what is better food now through agriculture and other forms, we couldn't really show that there was a commercially viable option. Today, it's no longer a question, but that doesn't mean that the bad food or the sort of food that isn't necessarily healthy went away. It's still there, but there is now a thriving and viable sector, and on the margin, more capital went to the new sector and the new growth. And that's a sort of an analogy or metaphor for what we think is going to be happening in technology.
But if I could just jump in, let's go ahead, please. I wanted to point out that I think that analogy does break down in the current structure of the tech economy. where, and Elizabeth, to the point you made originally, where the transaction you're talking about is, a business to a consumer model where I'm selling food to the consumer so they have a choice. And I think all of these things break down when you have to think about the way the digital economy works now, which is it's really an economy between, as you point out, advertisers and platforms where we are the commodity, we're the raw material out of which that food is made.
Right.
And so, we've had this thing extracted out of us, and I think that's where a lot of the confusion happens, because we're talking about, whether it's in antitrust law or in, it has these weird cascading effects, like this case we were talking about before the panel started, where if you actually trace out the long-term effects of real-time bidded ad tech, there are folks out there that have traced the effects to like the destruction of media. That any reputable media's outlet's value is in their audience and the identity of that audience. And if that identity is being recorded and stolen by data brokers and ad tech platforms, then you've just taken the value of the New York Times and stolen it essentially through the whole ad exchange ecosystem. So like this breakdown of that market structure has a lot of, I think, cascading effects, and that's why it's sort of interesting that even in this panel about markets and startups and innovation, there's sort of this fundamental assumption like regulation is a part of this because that's all one big externality. Like we are the externality of this privacy violating market. We've all had this thing of value extracted from us as if we were the food in your analogy, and I think that's important to point out.
And it's not like this is the first time that we've ever regulated tech. I mean, the petrochemical industry is regulated, the car industry is regulated, and over the last, 150 years, there have been these disruptive technologies and social change that goes with it. The social change that went with the automobile also was matched by a whole lot of regulations.
Right, but I think it's still important to point out, like, the externalities in the automobile industry were environmental, but if you really want to dig into this analogy, like it's the automobile industry, except we're the fuel. We're the gasoline.
Yep, and that's different.
And that's different, and that's what makes this a particularly pernicious problem, I think.
Elizabeth.
And I think that goes to, what is effective legislation? What is a good regulatory strategy? I think it goes to, looking beyond data protection and privacy. We see the limits of data protection and privacy in trying to deal with the entire situation we found ourselves in. So one of the most effective what we think of as sort of a privacy-related enforcement action in Europe actually came from the antitrust regulator in Germany, right? So there are all these other areas of law and regulation and this whole tapestry of kind of laws and regulations around consumer protection, around antitrust, around privacy and data protection that need to be woven in to have a really effective impact on changing the sort of status quo in the industry right now.
Well, so just also on that, so I hear you, Danny, that we're the product, and so the sort of analogies break down a little bit, but it's perfectly possible to do a little bit more customization locally. Doesn't always have to be centralized data. It's perfectly possible to do sort of versions of ad tech that are less intrusive. And as far as the studies that I've seen, the more intrusive versions of ad tech have a very marginal increase in effectiveness.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, I think the dirty secret about all the ad tech that's exploiting us, it doesn't actually work that way.
That's right.
It's all bot armies looking at ads put up by other bot armies.
Right.
They're always trying to sell me a shirt that I've already bought.
Or 6 other vacuum cleaners after you've bought a vacuum cleaner. But
I like vacuum cleaners.
but I think that I will say that at the same time, like the cat's out of the bag. Micro-targeting is not going anywhere, so we need to find a way to live with it in a fair and regulated way that doesn't exploit us all. That is not the what can I get away with before I get sued, because clearly we all don't have very much power.
Yeah, and I think, look, in a firm that certainly, does a lot of work with ad tech, who's, again, that's what privacy lawyers, focus on it in large part. They're being challenged right now. And we were talking beforehand, one of the issues with things like GDPR coming into place is that the bigger networks like Google and Facebook can figure out compliance, and it's a lot of the smaller ones that actually are struggling. Right. And so there's I think there's always a question of if you put these rules in place, does it somehow hinder innovation? I'd say no, it drives it. And there's a lot of interesting companies we've taken a look at that are trying to come up with, is there a different way that we can still deliver more relevant ads? Which, by the way, there's another side of this, which at a time when local journalism is dying, if you suddenly cut their ad revenue because you can't charge as much because you're not personalizing ads or delivering something that's targeted in some way, there's an effect there too. So this isn't just, you can't just look at this one part of the ecosystem without looking at other impacts. But the bottom line is it's driving innovation in the space, because some of the old ways that companies might have done stuff either already doesn't work under the new rules, or people are sort of seeing what's coming and thinking what might be coming next. And so I think it is catalyzing some good discussions around how do you make this stuff work? How do you get the same outcomes differently?
Yeah, and I think there's also the issue of sort of cross-border awareness. And since the GDPR, we've definitely seen this sort of Brussels effect of other countries around the world either amending their existing laws or introducing new laws and regulations in response, and sort of elevating the field globally. We saw a similar thing, obviously, with environmental law and the California effect. So I think we certainly have instances of regulation and law driving innovation. I think there's also just a lot to be said for certainty and clarity. So one thing we see right now, I do a lot of work in the sort of blockchain cryptocurrency space, is the paralysis caused by a lack of clarity and a lack of certainty around a lot of laws and regulations. And so jurisdictions that are introducing clear frameworks or sandboxes or some kind of law or regulation around this type of technology are gaining a competitive advantage and sort of attracting innovation in those jurisdictions. And so the hope is that a similar thing is going to happen around data protection and privacy.
Yeah, just to build on that as well as Jeremy's point. So Google now has racked up something close to $10 billion of fines. So I'm not sure if the big companies are having as easy time as it may seem. And it was also interesting to note that fairly soon after the last announcement, and this is not just GDPR, this is actually more on the antitrust side than on the GDPR side, that they did announce that they're now taking a look at their ad model. And there you go. That's an innovation prompted very much by a regulatory shift, or at least an application of regulation that existed. Where I see is even more important is the signal that sends to everybody else out there to say, let's rethink how we're doing this, because it's very costly now to continue and perpetuate the practices that got us where we are.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I'm going to put out an unsolicited question. We've prepared some sort of thought starters. Something occurred to me, and I'm going to put it out there for you to noodle on while we allow the audience to collect their thoughts and get their hands up for questions. So we do want to encourage some participation. So while you're doing that, the thought I've had is that I wonder whether we're at the very beginning of, what is it, the fourth industrial revolution. It's a data-driven economy. There must be more regulation coming. It seems to me that GDPR, for example, or CCPA, is like the light on the hill, but it's only a stepping stone. And I imagine that there's going to be a hell of a lot more regulation. So I want you guys to noodle on that and to think about what we should be regulating or what the dangers and perils will be. Think about that, and we'll give the audience an opportunity to ask questions.
Well, I'm happy to jump in if you want in the meantime.
Sure.
Or should I be noodling while they ask?
I'm not seeing any
There's a hand
hands up. Yes, we do. And there's some mic runners, so thank you, sir.
Are you familiar with the New York Times article that Gabe Weinberg, the CEO of DuckDuckGo, wrote maybe a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah.
About selling ads without necessarily doing the kinds of privacy compromises that we are seeing today. And if you do, I'd love some comments.
With the echo. Rajiv, there is a terrible echo we're getting back and forth that I don't think I could understand you. You could walk up, we can probably... It was echoing like 3 different times.
Yeah.
Could you come up here and then we could actually hear you? The audience may not be hearing this, but we're getting...
DuckDuckGo.
Oh, you couldn't?
So were you familiar with DuckDuckGo, and what do you think about it?
Oh,
Yeah.
DuckDuckGo?
Yeah.
That's essentially it. There was a nice editorial article.
This was about Chrome is basically surveillance tech.
And it's about,
Yeah.
hey, you can actually have ads without doing the kind of micro-targeting.
Yeah.
And he's laid out some interesting options.
Yeah, I think Danny mentioned this. So we've now kind of debunked the myth that targeted advertising is even effective, and actually contextual advertising is about the same, if not better. So this idea of if you're at a baseball game and there's relevant ad and everyone there is seeing it is about as effective as the. Is that? Have I?
Oh, I mean,
I
I think it is ironic that we're back to like the billboards are just as effective as the micro-targeting, but I think that has minimal impact on what the CMOs are actually, like the CMOs have data now at least. They don't care if the data is right. They have more data than they did. So I think there's still clearly a strong market demand for micro-targeted advertising, whether it actually works or not.
And I think that's where you question, and relevant to that editorial is the point really even to target us to sell things to us? Or are there sort of other secondary and tertiary purposes which are in blatant violation of all data protection privacy principles everywhere in the world, under every jurisdiction? And so it's,
specification.
Is it right? So what is actually, what is the purpose of all this surveillance tech really, if it's not even to sell us things because that's not so effective?
Well,
and also just the economy that it's created between all these third parties, and going to the sort of RTB context as we were just discussing before the panel.
Well, I mean, I think whether or not it's effective or not, there's been recent decisions in the EU that are probably putting some kind of fixed lifetime on real-time bidding advertisement now, which is really, personally, I think is great. But I also think that, whether or not it works, clearly there's a market demand for it. And so I think that it's not going anywhere. And I think in this country it is emergent that this surveillance capitalism is a result of the fact that there's at least a perception in the marketing world that it works better than contextual, billboards at a baseball game.
But I think the browser wars are a good example of this driving innovation, and we certainly have seen a lot of innovation in that context, and that's without even an e-privacy regulation in the books yet. So, I think it's a great example.
So I would, that's a great example, fully agree, and I would say there's almost no area of tech that is using data where we don't perceive that there will be a better way from a human-centric standpoint to do the same service equally or better. Danny is part of our portfolio, his perfect example of this. It's a cybersecurity company that is very respectful of personal data. And it's as effective or more effective than other solutions in the market. DuckDuckGo, I use it. There's Brave, there's other Proton, there's many options, and they will continue to proliferate. But it's not only those examples, but the whole question of personalization, which is, look, we're not going to argue that these aren't better than not personalized services. I love Spotify because it's nailed what I like. Okay, bands that I never heard of. But you can do that without requiring centralized data. And we're investing in that. And there's many, many other examples. These are just the tip of the iceberg. We just think that's where VCs need to focus. And then let's just say, Danny's right. These other services where we are today aren't going away, but they'll be an alternative. I mean, we can still, I don't demean McDonald's. My son really likes McDonald's. It's still there, but there are alternatives.
And I think it comes down to what is the purpose of the personalization, right? That if you're talking about Spotify or Netflix, those are great opportunities for personalized data to make their product better, but ultimately their product serves you.
Right.
If you're talking about the more core ad tech companies, you're the product, you're not the target customer, and I think that distinction of is the value being provided to you, or are you the value being provided to somebody else? It gets at the heart of what's already codified in these emerging laws.
Right. I think there's just a very basic expectation of what would you reasonably expect, right? I think that's been the issue is people have been quite surprised with all the recent revelations, and so I think something like Spotify, you probably expect that something will be tailored and targeted for you versus many other services where this is
the best example is
two
Google.
questions out here.
Sorry, I just want to make one more point about Google, which is there was a point at which when Facebook emerged, that Google changed the pillars of their search engine design from relevance and accuracy to personalization and engagement. And then if you think about that as the fall, where all of a sudden, imagine if the encyclopedia or the dictionary was rewriting itself as you were reading it to show you the most appealing version of reality. That's where it's not expected. It's expected on Netflix, but it's not expected in what you expect to be a definitive reference.
Right.
And just one last point. Wanted to ask, race to the top. You guys announced this a few months ago. How many venture capital firms have now signed on to this idea?
So there's now 13, and we're in a sort of an R&D phase. So we're working through what are the principles and what are the tools. And the principles are sort of 10 principles that we're articulating and developing further. And the tools are really around the full cycle, life cycle of VC investment, starting with identifying your thesis through screening and appraisal and due diligence, all the way through portfolio review, and embedding these principles throughout that life cycle. And so we've got a first draft of the principle, first framework of the toolkit. We've had one convening at MIT. We've had a subsequent call to further refine, and we're working through it. So when we get through the sort of National VC Association, the industry association, has now come on board, and they were going to help us take it further. But we wanted to start with sort of like-minded VCs to actually do the R&D of the toolkit and the process, and then we can take it out to others, because it will go to scale when the larger influential VCs get on board. And we just wanted to develop it a little bit before we get to that stage.
The reason I was asking, the fact that there's 13 in such a short time that have done so, and more that may be coming on, shows everything we're talking about here today, about things that are broken and things that need to change in the old models. The fact that the investment community is now shifting and saying we're going to fund different things, I think, to me, is the most notable thing out of everything we're discussing today.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that next company that might have come up with something that does awful things on privacy may never be created because they're not going to get funded. They're going to fund somebody like a Terbium instead, who's doing some great things in cybersecurity in a way that protects privacy, while there's other models that might do something different. That's really notable to me.
More questions? George.
So I guess you addressed it a little bit, but I think the issue is not don't collect data, because there are certain cases. I mean, Andre talked this morning about, I want identity to not even be present, right? It should be a seamless experience. To be able to do that in a secure way, I actually have to collect an awful lot of data about you, right? So then it becomes a matter of it's not that I don't collect the data, it's that I don't use it in a way you don't expect, or at least I'm transparent about, I give you the option, let's say, because there may be some people who are like, yes, please target me, or whatever. And in my ideal world, on the ad side, I'd much prefer to tell them, please, show me these kinds of things, because you'll actually get better engagement than what you guess.
And I'd like to filter that point, George, by saying that you're going to the issue of digital literacy. What do people understand about the use of information? What do they understand about how it flows? Do they understand why so much information is being gathered? Somebody talked before about the organic food movement. We have mental models about what organic food means. And those mental models are not terribly accurate if you talk to a chemist, but it's what consumers understand organic to mean. I don't know that most people out there have any meaningful clue about how information flows and why it's being gathered.
But I think the collection point is still really salient, because I think if you go to sort of how does this drive innovation, how does this potentially create new business models? And if you think about the VC model now, it's sort of the incentive, because the business model is so unclear, the incentive is just collect as much data as you can. And I think if that's sort of not the starting point, then for me, it's there are all these other sort of potential scenarios that arise, potential business models that will be on the table much earlier on. And yeah, right now it's just easier because, for a startup that doesn't really know, that doesn't have any traction, sure, the data is always going to be valuable. But again, how do we flip that paradigm and kind of incentivize more creativity?
And one point I'll make just on the flip side is, so since we're talking about identity, I think back to your point, George, identity needs data. We don't really have good identity systems if there's not data somewhere in there. So then it's a question of how do we construct them in a way that is privacy respecting and minimizes the risks rather than some of the earlier models that we've seen. But I've got another concern these days, which is as the privacy debate is ramping up around the world, that privacy actually ends up eating identity. I mean, I've been pulled into a number of Hill conversations where, they're considering restrictions that might actually put additional restraints in terms of our ability to use certain systems that are actually pretty important. I mean, one example we've been dealing with that industry's been trying to get some technical changes made is in California with CCPA, where unlike in Europe, where they do a pretty good line with GDPR between, hey, if you're collecting data for marketing or product enhancements, whatever that can mean, relative to protect security of the transaction, to make sure they're not preventing fraud. There's a whole bunch of stuff where we're collecting data behind the scenes on a transaction and applying risk analytics to it that's really valuable.
Ostensibly for good.
Right. So California, because they wrote the law in a week, I don't think this was intentional, they said, well, you can't go to Verizon Media and demand they delete any of that data that they've collected for security and fraud prevention. But there's nothing in there that says that you can't go to Verizon Media or your bank or anybody else and ask that they never collect that data in the first place. And so if even 1 out of every 50 customers does this because they, read something and they think that, behavior, biometrics are creepy, what do you do if you're a major service provider? Can they not get your digital service? Do you have to have an exception process for how you're sure there's not fraud? So I think this hopefully gets worked out in California, and at the federal level, people are starting to think about sometimes you need data and sometimes you don't. But it's an interesting. Again, I have concerns that in some cases when stuff gets rushed, privacy eats identity and some good applications get taken off the table.
But that was exactly Elizabeth's point. I think that it comes down to data collection's not going anywhere, personalization, customization, things like that. But it's to what end? Is it a reasonable and expected end? Is Facebook asking for your phone number to be able to verify your identity when you log in? Or are they using it to target, robocalls at you? And one is okay, the other isn't, and that's what the regulation is sorting out, is that consent.
Yeah. And I think it just demonstrates how contextual both privacy and identity are, right? And we have an impulse to over-identify right now, which in my view violates the data minimization principle. So we shouldn't be over-identifying. We should be, sufficiently identifying in the context of a given interaction or transaction. So you can take all the core sort of data protection principles and just import them into the identity context, and it's a pretty good guidepost for what we should and shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
And I think the next frontier.
I know you got another question out there, but just a quick response on this one. So part of the answer, we're not going to, so when we're looking at new investment and entrepreneurs, we're not solving for the old problems that exist today. We're not solving Facebook, but we're trying to get new entrepreneurs to think about data hygiene at a minimum, to think about some key principles. One of the principles we've been discussing, for example, is auditability. So make sure that you have logs. Make sure if later on you have to go back and trace, that you've sort of designed for that up front, because it's hard to retrofit some of these things. So as you are designing your applications, and in terms of, you said that data is necessary and I need to centralize it. No, you don't really need to centralize your data. In identity, a lot of it can be done on device. Personalization can be done on device. So there's also what you've done with regard to what data has been collected, as was just said, but also how are you managing for the rules and the auditability, the accountability for once you've collected the data. So there's a lot that you can do without compromising the quality of service.
Now let's go to another question.
Yeah. So actually totally ties to what he asked earlier and the rebate you kind of just gave him. So I work in security and identity security, and one of the biggest advantage of cloud identity is that you get that massive amount of data, and then you can aggregate it to find attack patterns and things like that to protect the users or remediate them when their accounts have been taken over or there's been some type of attack. And since the GDPR regulation came, we have had to make a lot of changes. There's data residency laws about where the data can live, and it's harder to combine that data in a way that makes all of our detections way, we have to make them less effective. So I would say that first, I think there is huge advantages when it comes to security and having actual centralized data, but also regarding what you guys have been saying to how do we regulate for different uses of this centralized data. We're not going to stop collecting it, but it's clear that even GDPR is not targeting security purposes, it's already affecting it. So what would be a different way to make rules and laws that allows the legitimate purposes of collecting this data and deters the bad ones?
I think this exposes a really interesting mismatch between a lot of the laws and what they're trying to do. So the reason that a lot of countries and jurisdictions have things like data localization requirements is often for exactly that, for things like security, national security, law enforcement. And what they're really addressing is, this sort of data nationalism is really designed to it's security by a different measure, right? So it's not this idea of cloud security, it's this idea of we want this for surveillance, right? And we want this for a different kind of security. And so we're importing these laws into a sort of commercial digital ecosystem context, but in reality, many of them are written from very different points of view, and also from very different stages of maturation of the relevant legal system or even the institutions in a given jurisdiction. So this is one of the hesitations when people say, we need GDPR everywhere. It's like, well, I'm not so sure about that because we have very, very different institutions and cultures in a lot of different jurisdictions where actually that could be quite dangerous. So a lot of these laws are not really written to effectively address that scenario. And I think also just the divide between public sector and private sector, of government uses of data and private sector uses of data, is another area that's really poorly resolved, in my view, in the laws and regulations.
We've 3 minutes left. Let's try and squeeze in Heather's question.
Yeah, great. So we all know the problems of unintended consequences. But I was really hoping to hear from you guys some examples of business models that are actually being done right.
Okay.
What do you do, Danny?
Thanks for the tee up. So us, for example, we work in the dark web intelligence space. Our founding story is the global head of information security for a wealth management bank came to us and said, hey, we want you, Terbium Labs, to watch this emerging part of the internet where people are trafficking in stolen data for signs that, in their case, their client information had been breached and was being traded. So we want you to watch for our client data floating around in this part of the internet that's come to be known as the so-called dark web. But the catch is, we can't give you the client list. Like, that client data is super sensitive. You're, in the time, two schmucks from Baltimore. We're not going to give you our very sensitive wealth management client information. So how would you do that? And that's where we started the company. So we developed a way, we gave them some software that computes this one-way signature of their data. We call it a data fingerprint. It's sort of a cryptographic hash of the things that matter. And then we built a whole search engine that goes and looks at this part of the internet in an analogous way. So we actually can search for their data without ever having to hold their data. And that's our fundamental innovation, that we are providing value to them, oddly enough, in the identity space already, but doing so in a way that doesn't actually increase the risk to them. Like, we don't have a copy of their client data on our system, so we kind of operate under this assumption that everybody is vulnerable to a data breach. You're never going to stop all of them. So if we were breached, there's nothing on our systems worth stealing, is kind of how we approached it. So there's an example of a business model where we're fully the other direction. Not only are we not monetizing all the data that we're collecting on our customers, but we're not even collecting data from our customers. So there's nothing on our systems of value in that sense. So I think there's a lot of business models. I think what you're going to find is there are just a lot more regular business models. I am selling you something of value, and maybe I am collecting data, but it's up to me to preserve that for the value of my business, because then you wouldn't trust me. And I think whether it's us or any more traditional, business to consumer or business to business model, where the consumer data that puts us all at risk is not the commodity, but merely part of the transaction, is the business model you're looking for. The problem is the business models we hear about all the time are the ones in which we are the raw material, and not the customer.
So, to wrap that up, people ask me, what does privacy mean? And they settle in for like a 30-minute lecture. But privacy is about restraint. to me, it's as simple as that. And what we have is a history of businesses in the digital economy that can't help themselves but to gather information that they don't otherwise need, or to hang on to information for as long as they can, and they can't restrain themselves.
I mean, look at Uber.
Exactly.
Uber, ostensibly, what is Uber's business model? Giving you cab rides from your phone. They go public. It turns out, by the way, they can never actually become profitable with that business model. So you hear rumblings now that what is their real money maker? The knowledge of where you've taken that ride and the, however many billions of rides they've sold.
So on that sort of scary note, we're going to wrap it up. I'm tremendously optimistic about privacy. It's a real sign that organisations like Identiverse pay so much attention, give so much bandwidth. We get so much attention and interest from the audience, and reasons to be cheerful about privacy. Thank you, Danny, Jeremy, Elizabeth, and Magdi. And thank you. Have a good afternoon.